Why don't we get going? Mike McCabe, thanks for joining us on this. I think you've done one more for us recently, but since, as Dennis says, you've been up to more mischief, it's always good to catch up and see what your thinking is. I know with your Substack, your blog, basically, you've got a lot of information out there, and it's not always political. It's personal development, a lot of things. But I know you also have done a lot of work, obviously politically, where we stand in the state, when you did all of your travel, when you ran for governor, and of course, all your work was Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. And am I remembering you also did the public information for the school district?
I did.
Yeah.
Back in the mid to late 80s.
Yeah, I think you used to, when I was city editor, I think we probably butted heads on a few things.
I suppose.
Well, thanks for taking the time to do this. Why don't you give a little introduction yourself, or where where your background? I know you've got that on your site, but people may not have a chance to look at it, and walk us through that, and then tell us about your new book.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. I wish we could be together in person. That is always a preference, but this will have to do for today. It's great to be with you, and if for those of you who may not know me, my name is Mike McCabe. And
okay, thank you very much.
And I was born and raised on a.
Mike, somebody muted you again.
Yeah, I saw that.
Sorry.
Am I back on?
Yep, you're good.
I don't know how much was missed there, but I was just saying that my roots are rural roots. I was born and raised on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, and I've lived a good chunk of my life in rural parts of the state. I've also lived a good chunk of my life in Wisconsin's second largest city. So I've had what I consider to be the blessing of living across the rural-urban divide with a foot in both worlds. And I think that has always been a helpful vantage point for me to be able to relate to what is going on both sides of what is now an increasingly pronounced divide. I went to the University of Wisconsin and am a graduate of its journalism school. I worked very briefly as a newspaper reporter, so I do have a journalism background. But much of my life has been spent in or around the state capitol. I led the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign for 15 years, a group devoted to following the money in state politics and seeking to expose and confront political corruption. As Terry mentioned briefly, before that, I worked for 6 years with the Madison schools. I was both the school district's communications director, but also its legislative liaison. So I advocated for the schools at the Capitol, and eventually started a group called Blue Jean Nation that was inspired by the earlier book that I wrote that was published in 2014. I did put a link to that as well as my most recent one in the chat if anybody wants to check those out. But that earlier book inspired the formation of a group called Blue Jean Nation, which I led for a number of years. And that ended up leading to a lot of people in that movement urging me to make a run for governor, which I did in 2018. During that campaign, I traveled over 100,000 miles in 11 months. And if you do the math, that's a mind-boggling amount of travel every day. It was an amazing experience. And I can tell you this, you cannot travel 100,000 miles in 11 months in Wisconsin by making trips between Madison and Milwaukee. You have to go to every part of the state, every nook and cranny, and I did. I not only traveled to all 72 counties, but I traveled to outposts in those counties that I had never been to. And I did a lot of traveling in previous jobs and really thought I knew my way around the state and had been just about everywhere because of the travels in previous jobs that put me on the road so much. but I indeed went to places I had never been before. And one of the things I found during that journey, which led me to write that most recent book, which had the great misfortune, by the way, of being published in late February of 2020. And so literally, you can't control the timing of book releases. It's a long, drawn out process to get a book from manuscript to printed copies and get it out there. It just happened to be released in February of 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic hit with full force in March of 2020. So all of these events and book signings and book readings and all these different things that were planned all had to be postponed and ultimately canceled. So that book didn't do as well as the earlier one that I wrote, and again, largely because of its unfortunate timing. But I reflected in that book about a lot of the things that I encountered as I traveled the state during that run for governor, and earlier work that I had done that took me to so many different places in Wisconsin. And what I found were people who are incredibly stressed. They are sort of at wit's end about where things are going, and it is leaving them in a condition of more or less perpetual anxiety. And some of those people are experiencing economic trauma. They have hit rough patches in terms of employment, and they are living on sort of a razor's edge when it comes to being able to make a living and make mortgage payments and keep food on the table. A lot of them are stressed out for other reasons, and a lot of it had to do with this feeling, especially in rural Wisconsin, that their way of life was in danger, or their way of life was in the process of disappearing, which is not a good feeling to have, regardless of who you are and where you live. But then in urban centers, there was a feeling also that things were sort of slipping out of control. There was a general angst about this sense that Wisconsin's not the state that it used to be, and so there was this tremendous anxiety that you would encounter everywhere. People in Wisconsin are incredibly friendly. They are incredibly gracious. They extend you hospitality, but that doesn't mean that once you scratch the surface and look below that exterior hospitality and good cheer, that you don't find some real serious anxiety. And I definitely encountered it everywhere I went. And and one of the things that I got to thinking is I would be shocked if people weren't on edge, and I would be shocked if people weren't at each other's throats, given what we're facing, not only in Wisconsin, but across this entire country. When you think about it, we are living in a state of emergency, and not a single emergency, but 6 emergencies all at once. And that is a heck of a lot for people to have on their shoulders. That's a tremendous weight to bear. Literally, we face 6 national emergencies. And the first that I would talk about is economic inequality. Second is health insecurity. Third is social injustice. The fourth is environmental insanity. The fifth I would describe as moral infirmity. And the sixth is political instability. Now, I'll talk about each one real briefly before we move on. But that, like I said, that's a tremendous weight to bear. It produces immense stress when people are living with these things looming over them. And I think, unfortunately, when you look at the political landscape, again, both here in Wisconsin and nationally, the political class has found that it's easiest to navigate these turbulent waters by sort of putting people at each other's throats, by sowing the seeds of division, by producing the kind of polarization that we have in our political world right now. It's actually something that is encouraged and is cultivated by those in the political class, which I think is tragic, because people have enough to deal with without this sort of manufactured division, and without being, having somebody in the political world sort of putting them at the throats of their neighbors or their fellow Wisconsinites. But when you think about it, I think the 6 emergencies to me starts with economic inequality, and that's an immense stress for people, because we've watched in recent years as the rich have grown substantially richer. There has been immense wealth showered on a few at the very top. The poor have gotten poorer and more economically vulnerable, and the middle class has been in the process of disappearing. We are losing our middle class, and more people are falling out of the middle class into this position of great economic vulnerability. Having grown up in rural Wisconsin, I see it particularly acutely in rural communities that are dying, and people are having a hard time finding traction in the workplace and in the economy that can keep their heads above water. You see it in inner cities. You see it in an urban setting. You see it in a rural setting. And of course, one of the factors underneath economic inequality is health insecurity. Now, when you think about it, we already had tens of millions of people uninsured in this country before the pandemic hit in 2020. We already had far more than that who were underinsured. They had insurance, but they had crappy insurance that really didn't allow them to get the kind of medical care that people should get. They had the kind of insurance that only protected them in the event of a catastrophe where they were hospitalized for a long period of time. But in terms of getting regular ongoing medical care, they don't have the kind of insurance that gets them that. So yes, we have tens of millions of people without health insurance. We have many more than that, many tens of millions more than that, who are underinsured and who are a pink slip away from that health insecurity leading to economic catastrophe for them and their families. Alongside those 2 emergencies, and of course, the health insecurity emergency was made demonstrably worse by the pandemic. Even though we had so many people either uninsured or underinsured, then all of a sudden we get hit by this global pandemic, and even more people are put in a vulnerable position in terms of their health. And it overwhelmed our medical care system for a good long while there, making cancer treatments harder to come by, making sort of routine medical care more hard to come by, because the healthcare system was so overwhelmed dealing with COVID. Then, of course, with those 2 emergencies, we have piled on top of all of that growing social injustice. And part of that is racial injustice, and that has intensified and is so very apparent and glaringly apparent here in these recent days, these recent weeks, these recent months, recent years. We've seen one incident after another, but it's not only racial injustice, it's class injustice. And it gets back to that economic inequality. It's people who are really being treated like refuse. They're being treated like garbage. They're being thrown away by our society. And like I said, having come from a rural background, I'm acutely aware of the heartbreak that comes along with people watching a small town wither and die. And they see their children go off and leave that community, and they know they're not coming back. And what future does a community have when it has no young people? But then, of course, there's gender inequality that is a big part of that equation that I describe under the umbrella of social injustice. But that, of course, has come into sharp focus with the U.S. Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade. And you see this attempt by some in our society to roll back the clock, to return to an age of more institutionalized gender inequality and take away the rights and freedoms of half the population of our state and our country. So that's another looming issue that is chronic, and it's hanging over us, which is a stressor, no question about it. And as if all that's not enough, we are in the midst of what I describe as environmental insanity. And I'm not just talking about the climate crisis. Of course, I'm talking about the climate crisis. Of course, one of the big elements of environmental insanity is what we are doing to this earth that is increasingly threatening not only the earth's health, but is having immense impacts on humanity across the globe. We're seeing it and feeling it here in Wisconsin, but of course it's seen and felt even more intensely in other parts of the world. And you probably are already making the connections between these various emergencies. When you see how environmental insanity plays out, you see how that too aggravates economic inequality. It aggravates social injustice. It aggravates health insecurity. All of these things are so tied. It's all sort of a part of an intricate web, which brings me to the fifth national emergency, and that's what I describe as moral infirmity. Now, I think the best way to sum this up is that a country cannot have weekly mass shootings and simply explain that away as a mental health crisis or a public safety crisis. When a country has weekly mass shootings, that is a moral crisis. That speaks to our morality. It speaks to something deeper than what is very clearly a mental health crisis that we do have on our hands in our society. It is more than a public safety issue. It is a moral crisis. And that then leads me to what I consider to be the emergency behind all of the other emergencies. And that's what I describe as political instability. I'm sure there's a better phrase for it or a better term for it, but I can't do a better job of bringing into focus what I mean by political instability than was done in our nation's capital on January 6th of 2021. We had an attempted coup. We had an insurrection that was aimed at overturning the results of a free and fair election. It was an attempted overthrow of an administration, an attempted overthrow of our government. And if a few people, several dozen people in various positions had acted differently than they did, that coup on January 6th may have succeeded. Now, when I say that the coup may have succeeded on January 6th, I'm not saying then what would have happened on January 7th or what would have happened on January 8th or what would have happened on January 20th. There may have been rioting in the streets. There may have been a counter coup. There may have been all kinds of responses or reactions. But when you think about, I've actually once lived through a coup d'etat. I spent 2 years in the West African country of Mali. And while I was there, there was a coup. There was an overthrow of the regime and the replacement of that regime. And what has always astonished me about coups that I see from a distance or that I've witnessed in person is how simple they are and how relatively easy it is to pull off such a thing. And we came perilously close. Now, I'm not saying that would have, if January 6th had succeeded in what these people had as their mission had succeeded, I'm not saying that would have been sustainable. I'm not saying that would have meant 4 more years of Donald Trump. Who knows what would have happened if the coup on the 6th had happened? And when you think about it, a handful of people, a relative handful of people acting differently than they acted on that day could have changed a whole heck of a lot. To me, that's the definition of political instability. When you have those kinds of forces at work in our society, trying to sow the seeds not only of dissension and division but also really trying to paralyze democracy, trying to undermine democracy. These are dangerous conditions. And of course, a political system that is more paralyzed or more dysfunctional than I have seen in my lifetime. We have certainly had greater political discord at periods of time throughout American history, but not in my lifetime. I'm 62 years old. I've never seen anything quite like the current moment. And when you have a government where there is so much polarization, so much bitter division, so much toxic partisanship, you then don't get the kinds of responses to all of those other emergencies that need attention. We're not getting the kind of response on climate that we need to have. We're not getting the sort of response to economic inequality or health insecurity, social injustice that we should have because of that political instability. So all of these things feed on each other, which then leads to a theme that I have encountered repeatedly in my travels, in conversations, at family gatherings. I've heard so many people say, it looks like we're on our way to civil war. And I've had an awful lot of people, certainly more than at any time and other time in my life, ask me, Mike, you think there's going to be a civil war? And I could be wrong, and this take could age poorly. I'll be the first to admit that. But personally, I don't think we're headed for civil war. That doesn't mean that we are not already in the midst of civil conflict, because I think we are. I don't think that civil conflict will grow organized enough or will take a shape that would qualify it as civil war. And so I don't think that we are headed for what people could describe as civil war. Now, that doesn't mean that there may not be bloodshed. That does not mean that there may not be riots in the street. That doesn't mean that civil conflict could grow to something that is beyond what it is today. Those possibilities exist. But for me, and I write about this in the book Unscrewing America, and I have to say that a lot of people have bristled at the title because they say, well, you're saying that America is screwed, and I say, well, wait a second. The title is called, it's Unscrewing America. It's about how we can be unscrewed. If we've got conditions that are frightening or are troubling, we can get ourselves out of this mess. And the book talks about how. But one of the things I do write about the book, and just wanted to share with you to complete my opening remarks, and then we can just go to questions and all that sort of stuff, is that I actually think the current moment has more in common with 1927 than it does with 1860. And I want to tell you a couple of things about 1927, and that makes me think that we are actually going through a moment very similar to 1927. And the first thing I want to mention is I will say by way of a recommendation for a book that I think you all should read. It's a book called One Summer by the author Bill Bryson. It's subtitled America 1927. And Bill Bryson takes us through this wonderful journey of all the moments of triumph, but also the moments of hideous turmoil and very troubling discord in American society. But he focuses the book on events that happened in one summer in 1927. And he sums it up. I just wanted to share one very brief passage in the book. Bryson says that there may never have been another time in the nation's history when more people disliked more other people from more directions and for less reason. And that strikes a chord with me, and it has a ring of familiarity and makes me think of the current moment that we're going through. So many different people from so many different directions at each other's throats and hating on each other, when we in fact have an immense amount in common, and we really should be cutting each other some slack, because we are all living in a state of emergency. We're all living with these 6 national emergencies looming over us. If there's ever been a time when we should be cutting each other some slack, this is such a time. And yet so many people are doing exactly the opposite. And that's what Bryson found in the year 1927, which leads me to the one other thing about 1927 that I wanted to share with you, that I think is an incredibly powerful episode in our nation's history. Not a very well-known episode. Many people didn't ever learn about this in school. I never learned about this in school. I actually learned about this episode from Bryson's book when I read it a couple, 3 years ago. In 1927, the US Supreme Court blessed forcibly sterilizing people who the court deemed unfit to procreate. And as a result of that US Supreme Court ruling, as many as 70,000 people in this country became victims of state-ordered sterilization. Some were in the court, the term the court used was feeble-minded. People were identified as feeble-minded, presumably mentally deficient. And some of those 70,000 people who were subject to state-ordered sterilization were deaf or blind or diseased. And they were forcibly sterilized by the state and with the blessing of the US Supreme Court. The mood of the country in 1927 was such that it was not a close vote in the US Supreme Court. The vote was 8-1. The majority opinion was written by a legal giant, Oliver Wendell Holmes. The interesting thing is that one of the true liberal lions of Supreme Court history, Louis Brandeis, joined Holmes in the majority opinion. Brandeis joined with Holmes and 6 other members of the United States Supreme Court to favor selective breeding to purify the national gene pool. That was the collective state of mind of the American people and its judiciary in 1927. And again, we have reached a point where you see this rising racial prejudice and bigotry, and you see this attempt to roll back the clock on women's rights. You see the the attempts, the ongoing assault on civil rights. You see the backlash against gay rights, and you know, it looks and feels an awful lot like 1927. Now, it should be noted that 1927, what happened then, what happened in that Supreme Court ruling, did not lead to civil war. And it's one of the reasons why I don't think we're headed for civil war this time either. One reason is just simple logistics. How exactly would you draw the Mason-Dixon line in a modern day civil war? There aren't clear battle lines right now the way there were in 1860. It wasn't North versus South. It wasn't free states against slave states. Now what you'd really have is hundreds, if not thousands, of battle lines drawn in virtually every state, pretty much around every major American city. And, you know, so it would be sort of rural versus urban, sometimes rural versus suburban, sometimes urban versus suburban. It would be not only different battle lines than we saw during the American Civil War, but also the reasons that people would be at combat would be different from state to state. The inspirations for that civil conflict would be different in one part of the country as opposed to another part of the country. So what we've got is civil conflict that is immensely complicated, both geographically complicated, ideologically complicated. So it's very hard for me to see something that would qualify as civil war come out of this. But what may well come out of this is civil conflict that does immense harm to our nation. It puts democracy itself in great peril and at risk of disappearing on us. You know, I think the alarms should be very loud at this moment. It's like a moment I've never seen in my lifetime for sure. And how we get out of this is going to be equally complicated. But one thing that I think is important about history, and why it's so very important that we teach history, we teach the history of what actually happened in our country, and we teach it honestly, and we teach it forthrightly. It's so important to do that, not only so that we know where we've been and we can learn the lessons of history, but one of the things about history is that also can be a source of great comfort and great inspiration. It should be noted that shortly after 1927, the country plummeted into a Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929. The country experienced a prolonged depression. Out of that, the country emerged without going to civil war, without losing its democracy. The country emerged and entered into an historic and lengthy period of great prosperity and great social and economic cohesion. Economic inequality dropped dramatically. Social inequality has been addressed decade after decade after decade, from through the 1960s into the most recent decade. We've seen these tremendous strides made in terms of social equality, and all of that came out of the trauma of 1927 and 1929 and what the country endured in the 1930s. So I'm absolutely convinced that we can get through this. I'm absolutely convinced that we can come out the other end, once we see light at the end of the tunnel, as strong or stronger than we've ever been. But it's going to take a great effort on the part of all of us. We are going to have to rise to the occasion as citizens, perhaps like we haven't been expected to rise to the occasion as citizens before in our lifetimes. But we can, if America is screwed, we can unscrew it. That's the bottom line. I don't think the answers, at least in the short term, are going to come from Capitol Hill or from any state capitol building. It's going to come from the people. We're going to work through this ourselves, and we're going to be the answer. We're going to be the solution. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And that's a theme that also comes through loud and clear in Unscrewing America, is that we can't look to the so-called political leaders of our nation to guide us through this turmoil and trauma. We're actually going to be the ones doing the guiding. We're actually going to usher the country through these difficult times. So let me just then read one brief passage from the final chapter of Unscrewing America that I think sums this up nicely. In the final chapter, I wrote that living in interesting times is said to be the Chinese curse. We're living in uncomfortable times. That's the American blessing. Life in America is changing rapidly, and change is discomforting. Discomfort brings about renewal. Comfortable people don't move. They stay where they are because they are comfortable there. To make them move, they have to be made uncomfortable. It's like the basic law of physics. An object at rest will remain at rest until some force makes it move. We are being made to move by these 6 national emergencies that we face. And so let me stop there. I hope these are useful thoughts to ponder as you continue your search for truth and your search for answers. Again, if you find that either some of the blog posts are good insight that you can make use of, or either of those 2 books, feel free to take advantage of those resources. But Terry and Denny, if is there a way we can just make this an open conversation now, and invite questions and comments, and just take it from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be able to. We know we have our chats, and I don't know, Dennis, if you want to people unmute themselves and ask. It's up to you on that. We do have one question right now: is what needs to happen to stabilize our political system? As you walk around Warner Park on your morning walks and thinking, where you got this book, all the things you've been thinking about, what needs to happen to stabilize that political system?
I don't have a magic wand that you can wave over these troubles and make them go away. But I do have one very strong conviction, one very strong belief, and that's that we are being relentlessly propagandized as a population, and we are being actively put at each other's throats. We all live in bubbles, and in those bubbles, we are in effect in our own news echo chambers, and those echo chambers have the effect of demonizing people who live in other bubbles and who get their news from very different echo chambers. That's the reality that we live in. And I think what we can do, the most subversive thing that we can do as citizens, is to consciously get out of our own bubbles and consciously resist always being in the same echo chamber, and actively pursuing opportunities to talk with people who we've been conditioned to see as the enemy. And those conversations can be immensely challenging, and they can be they can sometimes get very ugly. But when I said that I feel that it's a great blessing to have lived across the rural-urban divide with a foot in both worlds, I think of it as a blessing, because because I've grown up around people who now are Trump supporters, and they think very differently than I do. And I am in touch with people who think I've taken leave of my senses. And those, to me, are the most valuable conversations I can have, are with those people who we've been taught to see as the enemy. And I go into those, here's, if I can give a piece of advice, I go into those conversations not trying to change their minds. I do not go into those conversations with any intention or any hope of changing their minds. I go into those conversations just with an open mind, trying to better understand where they're coming from. And I'm honest with them about where I stand. I'm honest with them about what I feel and how I see things, but I don't expect the thoughts that I share to change them or set them on a different course. And I think so many of us fall into the trap of wanting to fix these people or change these people. And my experience is that that's a mistake. It ends up making those conversations go very poorly. And so I try to go into them consciously, not expecting or hoping to change their minds. It's fascinating how often at the end of those conversations, these people I talk to will say, you know, I disagree with a lot of what you say, but then there's some stuff that makes some sense too. And to me, that's probably as much of a victory as we can hope for at a moment like this. We need to, when so many people are being dehumanized, when so many people are being demonized, we have to humanize. I think that's our only way out.
Yeah. When Eric Severide did his final sign off for was the ABC, he said, remember how they had each of the major channels had someone who would give a thoughtful thing at the end of the 6 o'clock news, and he said on his final sign off, he said, you got to be a good consumer of the news. You can't just go to ABC, NBC, and CBS, it's the one you listen to all the time. You got to be moving the channel. And at that time, of course, only 3 channels. But even that advice is something I've used for people all along, for a long time, is to be a good consumer of the news. Your job is to look around and to see what's there. When I was working at the Paulett School, I had Fox News as my homepage for my website, which is not what I would normally want to do. And a number of friends, especially from the South, once I grew up in Tennessee, you go to the 50th class reunion, and lo and behold, those aren't the people you knew, or at least you cared about. You cared about the football team on Friday night, and now you find out, oh, look at that post that they are putting up. I really can't believe that. Yeah, it's keeping your mind open, but that I think is a really tough piece. But I like you're not trying to convince them, just trying to hear them out. I've got a neighbor who's about 90. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Terry, I also love your suggestion. And I think it's something I want to echo. I don't get a lot of my news from television, but I do watch some television news, but I stopped watching MSNBC. I haven't seen MSNBC for years now. And that was just a conscious choice on my part. I'm not going to watch MSNBC. I really, I do watch PBS NewsHour. I'll watch BBC. I will watch Fox. I'll sometimes turn on One America News. I consciously made a choice to try to diversify the sources of news that I got. And so I think your suggestion was one that dovetails really nicely with what I've suggested. So I'm sorry, Terry, I interrupted you.
No, that's good. Let's get some questions here. Someone asked whether or not, read recently, it felt like it would take a major level of disruption to unseat the corporate money interest running this country at the moment. Would it be a disruption like a war or a serious depression in a way that affects us all here at home? What would it take to basically get the corporate to stop unseat the corporate money interest running the country. That's the way it was expressed.
That's a wonderful question and not an easy one to answer, because think about it. I assumed that a pandemic, a national health crisis, would be something that would unite the country, and it ended up dividing us more. We ended up dividing into anti-vaccine, pro-vaccine camps, anti-mask, pro-mask camps. And so, the thought that a traumatic event like a depression or a war or a global pandemic, the thought was that was the kind of serious disruption that would help people put aside differences and unite. So maybe a depression would do the trick. Maybe a war that we were drawn into would do the trick, but a global health emergency didn't. It ended up dividing us further, which I think speaks to to how far we've gone down this rabbit hole that people also went down in 1927. But I think there's where you can take comfort in history. When fascism was rising in America, when you had a large assembly of Nazis in Madison Square Garden, when you had things happening in our country that were immensely troubling, and we're starting to experience those things again, the country did make it through those dark days and ended up sort of regaining the collective senses of the population. And so I think that we have to expect more of the Democratic Party. We have to expect much more of the Democratic Party, and we have to try to encourage sensible people to revive a healthy and constructive Republican Party. We have a very unhealthy two-party system right now. I often describe it as we have one party that is scary and another that is scared, and we need a party that will take on all 6 national emergencies in an aggressive way, and we need both parties to be functional, and I think that as citizens is something that we need to do. We need to expect more of those parties.
You ran as an independent, didn't you?
I did not. I ran in the Democratic primary in 2018. I have not been a member of a major party, but there you have that dilemma. If you run as an independent or third party candidate, then you end up being seen as the person who just took votes away from the candidate most like you, and you help elect the candidate least like you and farthest away from your values and your policy ideas. But of course, it's a significant challenge to try to run within a primary. But I think that 2018 primary did have a positive and constructive effect on the eventual outcome of that race. The Democrats had run against Scott Walker 3 times before. They had tried more or less to anoint a candidate as their nominee and clear a path for that nominee to become the party's standard bearer. And 3 times they did that, and 3 times Scott Walker won. And then when there was a Donnybrook of a primary, and the eventual nominee was forced to take far more bold and ambitious positions than either of the 2 candidates who preceded him and who lost to Walker did. That ended up being the time that Scott Walker was sent packing, and where the people ended up getting a change in leadership in the governor's office. So I think that's where instead of seeing primaries as a distraction or somehow taking away from the strength of a candidate. I think people should appreciate that. I think going back to at least Tommy Thompson, every single governor we've had was first elected having emerged from a contested primary. So this idea that everybody has to unite behind a candidate and we can't have contested primaries, I think is a losing strategy. I think if I could give any advice to people, resist the impulse to say everybody has to unite behind a single candidate and that candidate has to be able to save their money for the general election. That actually has turned out to be a losing path. And when candidates emerge from very contested, aggressive primaries, they end up being better candidates and they end up having a much greater likelihood of winning. And that's what happened in 2018. So I have no regrets about the way it all played out. It was an amazing journey, but I think also it was a constructive process that ended up getting us a change in leadership for our state, which after all is something that I was hoping to help bring about.
How do you feel the great man theory will play out in all these crises where individual roles take leadership, like Lincoln or Roosevelt? On the other hand, crises also begat Hitler and dictators. Is there another leader somewhere in the U.S. to take the reins?
I certainly don't believe in a great man theory. I think it's as likely to be a great woman as a great man, but I also think that real change comes from the grassroots. Leaders end up reflecting the wishes of people. And one of the observations I've made in all of my experience in and around the Capitol and on the campaign trail is that people always talk about politicians being leaders, but I've never known a class of people who in general are more followers than leaders. They reflect what the population is talking about and thinking about and wanting. They don't lead the population somewhere. They end up following those. They constantly are doing this. They're seeing which way the wind's blowing. They're constantly seeing which way the currents are flowing, and they flow with the current. And so I think real leadership actually doesn't come from a great man or a single political figure. It actually comes from people who make that leader, challenge that leader to be more than that person would otherwise be. And I think if we had an opportunity to talk to Lincoln or FDR or so many others today, they would probably acknowledge as much. And I think generally they feel like they need to be pushed if they're going to accomplish much of anything when they're in office. They need to be pushed, and that push comes from the grassroots.
Question here about looking for some sign of hope. Corporations like down in North Carolina and others, a lot of corporations are the ones that are stepping up to challenge, the things about anti-gay, anti-trans legislation in North Carolina, Indiana. Corporations, the question that he poses, corporations look to future customers who are young. Politicians look to current voters who are old. Is there some hope here about youth, and where does corporations fit in that? But the youth taking the lead out of this.
Yeah, and certainly corporate America can provide leadership by embracing, both in their advertising and in their corporate behavior, embracing people of color, embracing people who are gay or trans, and helping to bring about a change in social attitudes to have greater acceptance of the other in our society. And of course, media corporations have great responsibility in that area, and both through entertainment programming and news programming, they can help people see demonized populations or discriminated against populations in a different and new light. And The other thing I'll say is that I've heard a lot of people say that what really needs to happen for change to occur in our country is for the oldest generation to die off. And I guess now I've reached the age where I fit into the category of part of that group that people are waiting to die off, so that change can be brought about. But I would prefer to think that people my age or older can also continue to grow and continue to change. And I think one of the reasons we see, especially on the Republican side, so much demonization of feminism and gay and trans people and of course people of color, is that they're trying to exploit the fear that is out there, and it runs so very strong in rural and urban and suburban communities alike. This fear that our children are going to be worse off than we've been, and that their children are probably going to be even worse off, and that our small towns are going to die, our communities are going to wither and blow away. I think that fear is underneath so much of the other stuff that ends up bubbling to the surface and manifesting itself as bigotry. And if we address the economic injustice that is so tied to social injustice, and we've seen that in past generations, in past years in America, when people are no longer economically afraid, bigotry starts to fade away, or at least it dies down. And people are afraid out there right now, and that fear is leading them to act on their darkest impulses. So I think we need to look at what's underneath those dark impulses and try to address what the driving force of those impulses really are. And I think a lot of it is this feeling that I've been kicked to the curb. I don't think there's a place for me in this society anymore. I don't think my kids are going to have it as good as I had it. I don't think my grandkids are going to have a very bright future. Those are the underlying forces that end up fueling bigotry. And I think if we address that as a nation, we also do a lot to address the causes of bigotry.
We got a question here about gerrymandering. Of course, the only time that, based on gerrymandering now, the only way you can get a statewide election as a Democrat is as a statewide election. What's your take on gerrymandering? We've had all these counties pass resolutions, and we still have what we have.
Well, this is a painful subject for me because in 2009 and 2010, I was leading the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, and we were trying to get, and if you think back, in 2009 and 2010, the Democrats held the governor's office and both houses of the legislature, and they were very timid about addressing many of the growing problems in our state. I also could not, or the people who were working with me, we could not convince them to do redistricting reform. We could not convince them to act on this sort of problem. And I look back on that and think, if the Democrats had really used the power they had in 2009 and 2010 to enact reforms and to take bold action on these growing problems, whether it's student debt or growing economic inequality, or if the minimum wage, if they had acted on those kinds of things in 2009 and 2010, they may not have lost state government. And all they needed to do was hold on to one of the two houses of the legislature or the governor's office. So they didn't need to win all three. They had all three in 2009 and 2010. But if they could have just held on to one of the three by acting more assertively when they had power, and really doing something on the minimum wage, on health care, on student debt, on redistricting, if they had a whole list of accomplishments that they could take to voters, and they had been able to hold on to one of the three, the gerrymander of 2011 never would have happened, and Act 10 never would have happened, and we would be in a very different, we'd be having a very different conversation in Wisconsin right now. But gerrymandering happened, and it's painful to think back on that. All those conversations I had up at the Capitol, and all the, you know, and all the times I was told, told no and told to get lost. That's painful to think back on. So we have to deal with the current reality. And I think the current reality is that we now have a gerrymandered state. And that means if there's going to be change down the road, Democrats are going to have to figure out a way to compete in places where they're currently not competing. And right now, the party's impulse is the opposite. They are increasingly ignoring rural districts. They're not even trying to run anybody in those rural districts. They're not putting any resources in any of those districts. They have basically just said, we're going to focus on winning the cities, and we're not even going to try. They're writing off rural Wisconsin and rural America. I think that is an immense mistake, because
turning over in his grave.
Things eventually change. Tides will turn, and people, if Republicans gain full control of our government, then people will grow disillusioned with their. They don't have a productive agenda to offer people, and people will get disillusioned. And when they start to change, there need to have been Democrats running in those districts so that people didn't just hear a Republican message for the last 20 years, that they've been hearing about a Democratic alternative. And so if I could encourage you to do anything with respect to challenging the parties, I would encourage all of you to do that, to be in touch with any legislative Democrat or any Democratic Party of Wisconsin person you run into. Tell them you got to compete everywhere, and you cannot write off parts of the state that you're currently losing, because Democrats used to win in places like that. And I don't know if it'll be 10 years from now or 20 years from now or 50 years from now, but Democrats will win there again. But you can hasten the day when that happens by competing there and spreading your message there when you're losing. It's important to make use of election defeats. It's important to lose in the right way and gain something from each defeat. I'm very troubled by the extent to which the Democratic Party is writing off parts of our state and parts of our country where they used to win, and they don't anymore. And I get it, they don't win there anymore. And it's hard having conversations with voters out there because they don't like Democrats. And I experienced it because I went to all 72 counties, and I had a lot of people telling me to get lost because I was running in the Democratic primary. But you've gotta have those conversations. You've got to keep the lines of dialogue open with people in those parts of the state.
Have you talked to Kathy Kramer Walsh much at all? I mean, you both your campaign and her work, and Dennis is certainly aware of this as her mentor. The same. You found the same thing, except it's been exacerbated, I guess.
Yeah, Kathy and I actually did a number. We were almost doing like a road show together for a while, where we were kind of tag teaming and doing presentations places. So Kathy would do kind of the academic perspective, and then I would do kind of the more grassroots citizen type perspective, from the vantage point of sort of a political practitioner. We do see things very much the same way. We see the same signs on the same warning signs on the political landscape, and we've come to a lot of the same conclusions. Kathy's book is a wonderful piece of work. If people haven't read it, it has Scott Walker's name in the subtitle. So that kind of dates the book. But boy, there's so much truth in that book that resonates yet today. So, get past the dated subtitle. It's still a wonderful book and well worth reading if you haven't already read it.
Dennis, you got some questions you want to pop in here?
One, I guess, a number of questions have already come up that I think I'd like a little bit more discussion about. If we go to 1927 and we look at what happened in response to that, I mean, there was, as some of our participants have pointed out, there was the Great Depression. There was what we call a great man, FDR. We were at that time on the brink of maybe following some of the European countries in terms of the fascist issue. But, big difference between now and then. There's several that I wonder if you would comment on. One is that when you're talking about a civil war, first of all, I agree that it's unlikely that we will have a regionally based civil war. And actually, if you go throughout history and around the globe, most civil wars are not regionally based. They're ideologically based or based on religion or something of that sort. And what we do have now that we didn't have in 1927 is somebody like Trump, who really is a catalyst, a leader of the people who are indeed, as you and Kathy have pointed out, resentful. And he catalyzes that. He expresses their anger, and he plays to their fear. And that's what his political leadership, if we want to call it leadership, is really based on. So there is that, but it's not just coming from the people. It's how you take the anger and the resentment and what you do with it. And when we've got somebody like Trump, who is indeed basing his leadership on those kinds of sentiments in the public that are urban as well as rural, he's done it in a way that really threatens democracy. And indeed, I think there is a prospect for, call it civil war, civil unrest. It's not good.
Mhm.
I think a major concern right now is the election deniers. If the election deniers win in the midterms, that's going to strengthen his leadership and his effect on our democracy and on our country. And it's going to be a great threat. I mean, you just think about, you've got all these people, including some who are in charge of administering elections. And they're basically saying, I'm not going to accept the results of the election that's going to be fraudulent unless I win. And even then, it probably was fraudulent. That's a threat that we didn't have in 1927. We didn't have Trump in 1927. We had FDR. He indeed provided some leadership out of the Depression. It was very difficult for him to provide leadership in the Second World War. He wanted to get involved in the war way before the public did. But again, it's a sort of somebody who has this particular set of values and a particular vision and interprets events and interprets public sentiment in a way that's much more positive, much more oriented on social justice and the kinds of crises that you've described. And I guess what I'm concerned about is indeed this leadership and the absence. I mean, I understand and agree with you in terms of, yeah, we need the grassroots support. We need people who are not just depending on a leader, but we also need a leader. We need a Barack Obama on the other side. And I don't know who that is. Maybe somebody will emerge. I don't think it's necessarily inevitable that we will have a leader that will provide the leadership that takes the events and the sentiments that we're experiencing now and turns it into something more positive.
Boy, can't disagree with a single thing you say, Denny. I also think it's important to look at every period in history and as it relates to the current day and realize that things are so very different. You're right. A lot of things that although 1927 maybe echoes in a certain way that brings to mind current forces that are very much at work here in our country today. In 1927, there was no television, so there was no Fox News. Hell, there was no Fox News. There was no television. There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. There was none of the social media landscape that we have today. So many things are different, and so we are in a position of sort of maybe learning from history, but also forging a brand new path at the same time. I don't want to diminish the importance or value of leadership, but I do want to emphasize that leadership can come from places other than elected officials. Martin Luther King or Gloria Steinem, or you think about so many people who provided really important leadership and pushed elected officials perhaps to do things that they were not otherwise comfortable doing, often have been as impactful as any elected official. But FDR unquestionably was a great man, and his impact is undeniable because my father, who grew up, he was born in 1919, lived through the Depression. His family lost their farm in the midst of the Depression. He ended up fighting in World War II, ended up living the rest of his life, got back into farming, and every single candidate he ever voted for in his entire life was the candidate who most reminded him of FDR. He measured every candidate for the remainder of his life by the extent to which they reminded him of FDR. That was what a looming figure Roosevelt was. I think back to Roosevelt, and when today, when corporate America, when the socialism slur is thrown at Democrats and they sort of cower in the bushes, and of course they lobbed the same slander at Roosevelt. And he gets up and gives us a speech, an inaugural speech to the nation, saying, "I welcome their hatred." He was undaunted by things that leave today's politicians very daunted, and that's the kind of leadership that's needed. 1927 did end up, of course, ushering in the New Deal. And that was dramatic economic and social change that was brought about, and Roosevelt deserves as much credit as anybody for bringing about the New Deal. But out of that trauma and out of the bigotry and out of the turmoil of the late 1920s, you ended up with one of the most dramatic periods of social and economic change our country's ever witnessed. And people like my dad, then for the rest of his living days, he said, that's the kind of leadership I want. Whoever seems closest, that's who's got my vote. That's an amazing imprint on our society, and we could use that kind of leadership today. But as citizens, how we can get it is by challenging those in the political arena today to become much more bold, much more aspirational. And my great fear is that Democratic voters have done the opposite, that they've kind of urged the politicians to play it safe, to moderate their views. There was nothing moderate about what Roosevelt was suggesting for the country. and he made many, many enemies, and famously said, "I welcome their hatred." And I think when you're facing the kinds of national emergencies that we're facing today, we need leadership at least that bold. And as voters, I think we've done a poor job of nurturing that or encouraging that, because we've actually done the opposite. We've actually tried to get a more cautious, more moderate approach. And a leader like Roosevelt is not going to emerge from an electorate that is seeking caution and moderation.
Good point.
There's a Michael. You can see the chats, can't you?
You can.
Probably easier for you to read Michael Stevens. It's sort of long. Breaking down norms, maybe the worst thing that's happened. Historians point to George Washington stopping his officers from marching on Congress. No military coups are part of our tradition because Washington made it unthinkable. Likewise, a peaceful transfer of power. Historian Jill Lepore writes about the importance of parties. The two-party system turned out to be essential. Turns discontent. And you see all this, the bottom line is Trump broke that tradition.
Yeah, and that's what I was hearing Denny say as well. Is that one of the big differences now is that we have Trump on the scene, and there are, what was January 6th except a systematic attempt to violate norms? And what that did is it made us all aware of how fragile laws are, how fragile the Constitution actually is. I think we were all under the illusion that the law is the law, and we've got the law protecting us, or we've got the Constitution protecting us. But so much of the power of the law or the power of the Constitution is rooted in practices and norms. And there's accepted behavior that has always been, that we've always taken for granted, that springs from those laws, that springs from that founding Constitution. But if you simply, as Trump has, simply say, I'm not going to follow those norms, I'm going to break those traditions, all of a sudden the law looks a heck of a lot more flimsy than it did before. And the Constitution itself looks a lot more fragile than it was before, if people are not willing to follow norms. That's a remarkably important point. So what we have to do as a society, whether we succeed at this or not, that's going to determine our fate. But we have got to reinforce and shore up those democratic norms and customs that have been, for the time being, sort of cast aside. That's really important if we're going to hold on to democracy in our country.
Yeah, it's the rule of law with it. One thing I wanted to respond to you, Dennis, on that, and Mike, get your ideas on this too, is you may have seen the article in the Washington Post this week about New Hampshire's efforts on their special committee to basically reestablish the integrity of elections. They've gone around, and this is one of my thoughts about the role of government, is its convening function. And if people still will believe in government, but they've gone around the state since May, having these hearings, listening to the grievances with Dems and Republicans both on this commission, listening to the people talk about what they're concerned about. And there's been a really organized effort to try to bring civility back to, talk about a homogenous state, New Hampshire. Maybe it doesn't work so well in Wisconsin and in California, but the gist of the article in the Post was, here's the effort by at least one state to try to get away from the election deniers, Dennis, trying to set up expectations a different way. I'm just curious your comments on that, or your thought on that.
Well, there's so much incivility right now, and there is so much trust that's been lost between the feuding factions in our society. the only way I know to reestablish that or to get us to a better place is with dialogue, with people talking to people, with neighbors talking to neighbors, and family members being willing to have difficult family gatherings because they're dealing with that uncle who has kind of gone off the deep end, and we've all got that in our families. Yeah, you know, as you were talking, Terry, I was reminded of something that a comment that was thrown my way on Twitter just yesterday, and the person said, "Well, how can we have a democracy when there's no democratic process, or how can we have a rule of law when the laws are just are treated with such disrespect?" And my answer, whether it was a good one or not, my answer was that, well, democracy is not a thing to have; it's 1,000 things to do. And my blog is not is not coincidentally named More Verb Than Noun. That's the name of the blog, is More Verb Than Noun, and that's what democracy is. It's more verb than noun. And I think that's what Trump understood. That I think a lot of Democrats have a lot of faith in what the law is, what the system is, what the process is, what the institution is. That's what will make our society safe for democracy. And I think what Trump understood was, no, it's actually a lot more about norms and customs and practices. And if I break all that, what you've got is an edifice that suddenly is quite shaky. And I could just say, I'm not leaving office. And I could just say that the election is fraudulent. And I could get a whole bunch of people to believe me. And I think that sort of brings me back to that idea that we need to shift our thinking about what democracy really is. Is it a noun? Is it something we have? Or is it a way of life? Is it 1,000 things that we do? And I think that's how we catch up to Trump, is to appreciate the extent to which behavior matters, and behavior is powerful, regardless of what the system is, regardless of what the process or the institution that's been constructed is. Behavior matters. Human behavior matters, and democracy's fate will ultimately hinge on human behavior. So we've got to do the work that we can do to try to nurture constructive, positive behavior that is friendly to democracy rather than hostile to it. We've got to take to heart the idea that democracy is not a noun. It's not something we have. It's a verb. It's something that we do.
The best description I've heard of that is that democracy is like a raft. It floats, but your feet are always wet. And when you talk about that kind of behavior, what we do, so again, trying to learn from everybody else what's going on. I watched the snippets of Hannity last night on Fox just to figure out what's being said, and the fact that they could play the tape of Joe Biden, the audio tape of talking to his son Hunter and saying, "Man, I love you, pal. I don't know what you're in trouble. I don't know what we're going to do. You got to figure this out." To play a tape like that on Fox, where a dad is understanding the mental illness of his son, and to somehow think that playing that tape is a gotcha moment on Joe Biden, that was hard for me to listen to and watch. Especially, where's your brain that says, any of us who have any mental health issues in our family, and you try to say, "Hey, I'm there for you, pal. I love you. I'll do anything. I'm standing by you." That could be a gotcha moment. I sometimes, I don't know how, Mike, to be able to talk to people when that is the kind of thing that's being done. I don't know how to regain that.
Oh, that's not easily regainable. And it certainly won't happen fast. And it certainly won't happen with one conversation. It's going to take 10,000 conversations. But here's where I think, whether you want to say Democrats or liberals or progressives, whatever label you want to put on it, you know, one of the things that I think people on the left need to do a better job of is basing conversations not on facts and details, but on values, on feelings. We need to be able to talk about what we feel and what we believe at our core, and not simply try to tell people you're wrong because of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And if you would just open your mind and consider these facts, you obviously would change your mind, you stupid fool. That's kind of the nature of the conversations that the left is having with the rest of the country all too often. And I think and I actually wrote a blog piece on this, an article on my Substack platform about this, that when you think about the really great communicators on the left, like FDR, like Martin Luther King, they did not dwell on facts. They spoke from the heart. And I think the only way we can touch those hearts that have hardened is by speaking from the heart ourselves. And I understand that people on the left they love facts. They love collecting them. They like sharing them. They love facts. And I'm the last person on earth who's going to say that facts are a bad thing. But along with that storehouse of facts, we have to have a willingness and an ability to speak from the heart and speak powerfully from the heart. And I think that's what ends up melting the most frozen heart is when it's when the message comes from the heart itself. And that's where we've not done a good job. We've become too wonky, and we've gotten too academic in tone, and my apologies to all the academics in the audience, but when you think about the great communicators, they were so good at striking a chord with the heart, and they were able to move people. And I think we need to take that into careful consideration as we go forward. So, you know, one of the things I say is that people on the left tend to emphasize what should be done and how it should be done, but they never talk about why it should be done. The why gets skipped right over. And we need to do a better job of describing why we believe the things we do, rather than just what we believe and how it all should be done. And that's what brings the heart into play, is you know, what's in your heart, what really motivates you. And I think that's what can move people. What I've found is in those conversations with the Trumpers, it's the only thing that works. If you can strike an emotional chord, my strategy is I listen to them for 5-10 minutes, and inevitably they say something that I have that creates a common thread. Oh, my dad was a farmer, or you know, I know somebody who lives there. You've got family in that town. I've got family in that town. You look for those common threads. And what I've found is that the conversation always goes better once you've established some rapport with the person, and they don't see you as the pin-headed liberal from Madison, who they think is the manifestation of all evil in the world. Now they think of you as the guy who, you know, has family right down the road from where they've got family, and grew up in a similar town that they grew up in, or maybe even the same town, or has somebody in their family that is in the same occupation, is doing the same kind of work, whether it's in the trades or whatever it is. You know, I know somebody who did that work, and it's been immeasurably helpful for me to just talk farming with people out in rural communities. And they understand that I must be honest, that I must have grown up on a farm, because I know these things that your average person wouldn't know. And it's been immeasurably helpful, because it opens a door to continued conversation that otherwise would be closed. But what is that? But getting to the heart, rather than just having the conversation solely up here.
That's awesome. the credibility thing is so important. I remember at the Milwaukee Journal, newspapers lost a lot of credibility a lot of times by just having wrong information on things, pictures. My favorite one is Milwaukee Journal had a picture, spring, a guy out in the farm, send the photographer out. Here's a farmer, clearly, plowing his field. Cut line says farmer plowing his field. The guy is throwing manure, and it was anybody who knew anything. You read the paper and go, that's a manure spreader. That's not a farmer plowing his field. That kind of thing. Dennis, you get to ask the last question, I think, about witching hour, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is a bewitching hour. I think we've covered a lot of great territory, and I really appreciate what you've brought to our discussion, Mike. It's been great, not only in terms of the substance, but I think the civility that you've demonstrated yourself and talked about the idea of listening and listening to everybody and not yelling back at them, but showing them that there is an alternative, that we've got values that we share, and doing it in a very civil and respectful way. I think that's the way forward, and we keep our fingers crossed that we're going to have the leadership that we need, and that it's going to be bold. And there are a lot of challenges that we have, no question about it. One that came up in the chat we've talked about previously a couple of sessions ago is accountability. There's a real dilemma. What do you do? Do you bring Trump to account? Do you make him be accountable? Is he above the law? The answer, I think, but for most people is, including people on both sides, right, left, and center, is no. The rule of law means something, and people have to be held accountable. But for those people who are avid, emotional Trump supporters, that's throwing down a gauntlet. And it's not upholding our values and our institutions. So there are some real challenges, and I think what we've all got to do is follow this path of being civil and understanding as we provide the foundation for moving forward. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It was
Anytime.
Wonderful, Mike. Appreciate it. And appreciate everybody out there for all your questions.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
All right. Enjoy your day. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye-bye.
Okay. See you next week, and we'll take it from there. Bye now.